Well, again, we welcome you this morning, especially those of you who are guests with us today. Thank you for coming. You can tell by my voice that either spring has got me or I've caught something, so that's good news and bad news. The bad news is it's not going to sound too good. The good news is you're going to get out early. So before we get into the lesson, JP wanted me to mention the Easter egg hunt on April the 17th. We have empty eggs out in the foyer. If you pick up some of those and fill those and bring them back for the kids on the 17th. It's one of our big outreaches into the community. And so it's a lot of fun for the kids, and I guess we're kind of Cadbury. We're filling the eggs. So come and do that if you would. Pick some of those up as you leave, and then bring those back full. I'm going to ask you to turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We're going to look at a couple of verses, and I'm going to talk about the paragraph starting at verse 13. As you're turning there, let me just mention what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Most of you know that a little over a year ago, my wife passed away from a glioblastoma brain tumor. And last Sunday, in fact, was the first anniversary of her funeral. She passed away on the 12th of March. My daughter and her family and I buried her on the 16th, and we had the funeral service on the 17th. And many of you were here that day, and I appreciate your support and encouragement in that time. And I thought for a little while this morning, I'd like to reflect with you about some lessons that I have learned about grief and sorrow during this year. Now, I hesitated to even do this sermon. It kind of was a last-minute thought. I'd prepared or had been working on something else for today, and while I was visiting my daughter a little over a week ago, where I picked this up, it was grandkids, you know. But anyway, I woke up one of the mornings I was there, and the idea occurred to me that maybe it would be useful to talk about things that we can learn in times of grief. I hesitate because I don't want this to be about me. I never like that. This is about God. This is about things that would be helpful to you. This is not therapy for me. This is something that I thought might be useful to us because there are many of us in our congregation who are struggling with grief and sorrow and various kinds of loss, not just the loss of a family member, but there's all kinds of things that we struggle with. And so I thought maybe that would be helpful to those who are dealing with grief and loss. Also, there are some of you who have yet to go through the kind of grief and loss of losing a close family member. The truth is, if you haven't done it, you will, or you will be the cause of someone else's grief. And so I'd like to give you some nuggets to take with you. And I know that you can't really prepare for loss, but maybe there are a few little things that you can keep in mind as those kinds of things approach. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Paul begins this paragraph and he says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope." I want you to notice in this sentence that Paul doesn't say, as believers, followers of Jesus, you don't grieve. He's talking about their family, their friends, loved ones of various kinds who have died. And he doesn't say, because you're a follower of Jesus, you shouldn't be weeping, you shouldn't be grieving. Instead, he says, you don't have to grieve like those who have no hope. It's different for you. It's different for followers of Jesus because there's a hope that is there that is different from pagans who have no hope. And you can talk about all the various aspects of hope. Hope is closely associated with faith. Remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul says, now abides faith, hope, and love. These three, the greatest of these is love. Faith and hope are very closely tied because hope is that anticipation that something good is coming. And it is a faith-filled anticipation. So we hope. And he goes on in this chapter to talk about one of the things or some of the things for which we hope. He talks about Jesus coming back. And with him will come all those people who have preceded us in death. They'll come back with Jesus. We will see them again. We will see the Lord himself. And he talks about this great event. And in fact, the people of Thessalonica had gotten so enthralled with the idea of the second coming of Jesus, they thought it was going to be any day. And many of them, historically we know, quit their jobs and were kind of sitting around waiting for Jesus to come back. That's how much they anticipated it. We don't know when it is. Paul says, but whenever it happens, here are some of the good things that are going to happen. And then he closes this paragraph, therefore encourage one another with these words. We are in need of encouragement. I used to think that we came to church to worship, sing our songs, to take the Lord's Supper, to obey God in fulfilling the commands. And then when we got to the sermon part of the service, that we were here to learn some more Bible knowledge. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think it's okay that we learn some Bible facts and so on and pick up some thoughts that we might not have had. But I really think that we are primarily here because we need the encouragement of God in our lives for whatever we're facing. And I think you came today because you hoped that for whatever you're dealing with in life, that there would be the presence of God here and something said, a song sung, a remembrance in the Lord's Supper, something in the sermon, a prayer that has been offered, something that is going to give you that little piece of the presence of God in a way that is special and important to you. And so Paul says, encourage one another with these words, because we desperately need encouragement. It's a hard world that we live in. You know this. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. All of us are dealing with something that is hard and harsh, and it is part of the curse that has come upon this world because of the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden long ago. I thought it was interesting. God tells us that because, or told Adam and Eve, the day you eat this fruit, you're going to die. And we understand there's a spiritual and a physical separation involved in that. But death enters the world. And that curse is on all of us. But isn't it interesting that God says to us, I want you to know that I know what this is about. I want you to know that I'm going to feel the same thing you're feeling. In fact, I'm going to die a death that is so much worse than most of you will ever know. And he took on the form of flesh, and he lived among us as Jesus, and he went to the cross, and he died. God wants us to understand that he understands. When you and I are in the pain of grief and sorrow, our God understands. And you look at the cross, and the cross is so important to us in so many ways. But the cross screams to us, I know what you're dealing with. Because the Son died, and the Father felt the loss. I don't understand the Godhead and so on, but I understand that Jesus laid down his life, and the Father laid down the life of his Son. And Jesus felt the pain of death, and the Father felt the pain of loss. Let me talk about grief just a minute. Some of the things about it that I think are pretty significant. Number one, we grieve because we love. If you're grieving the loss of a loved one, it's because you love them. The higher the level of grief usually indicates the higher level of love. It's a great and powerful emotion, love is. C.S. Lewis said this, "To love at all is vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable." Lewis understood, and if you know the story of C.S. Lewis, you understand that he learned to love late in life. And when his wife died, it was a devastating blow to him. But this emotion of love is key and significant to us. When Jesus waited for Lazarus to die in John chapter 11, he finally comes. Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days. The body has begun decaying. And as he approaches, both Mary and Martha come to Jesus and they say, "Lord, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died." They knew that to be true, that Jesus could have healed him from whatever his illness was. But Jesus purposely waited because he was going to do something spectacular. He was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Isn't it interesting that Jesus stands at the tomb of Lazarus and knowing what he's about to do, he weeps. The Jews say, "See how he loved him." Why did Jesus weep at the tomb of Lazarus? He loved Lazarus. He loved Mary and Martha. He felt the pain that Mary and Martha were feeling. He felt the loss of his friend. And Jesus wept. If you've lost a loved one, someone near to you, special to you, I want you to know that Jesus walked with you in the midst of that. That Jesus was there at the cemetery with you. And that as you wept, he wept. When Laura and Taylor and Jax and Rhett and I took Linda's body to the cemetery, I found out that I wasn't the spiritual giant in front of my daughter and her family that I thought I'd be. I blubbered a few incoherent things at that gravesite. And we watched as they placed that coffin in the ground and covered it. But I believe that Jesus was right there weeping with me. That Jesus felt the pain that we were feeling. And that he stood at that same tomb, same cemetery site with me and walked with me through that. I found out that grief is not our enemy. Early on in my grief process, I made statements like, I'm going to fight through the grief. I'm going to fight grief. I'm going to resist it. And what I have found through the process is that grief is actually a very hard friend. And I know that sounds the opposite of what we feel, but I think it's true. And here's why. When you experience grief as a follower of Jesus, where do you go? Grief takes you into the throne room of God. Grief takes you into the very presence of God, and I think that's the job of grief. It brings memories, it brings sorrows and so on to us, but grief transports us from here into there because the only healer is God. You and I can encourage one another. Paul says to encourage one another with these words. We can do that. You can't heal me. I can't heal you. You and I can encourage one another, but we can also distract one another from the grief process. And unless you deal with the grief, you're not going to be healed. Now, am I healed? No, not completely. I'm on the way. I'm on the mend. There are things that I am more capable of this time this year than I was this time last year. And through the process, a lot of things have transpired in this year that have been beneficial to me along the way. So not only is grief powerful and helpful to us, I learned that our emotions are also powerful and real, all the emotions, and that oftentimes they're not easily controlled. In fact, we sometimes lose perspective because emotions become so overpowering. If you're in grief or have been or will be, notice that you have dealt with things like anger. You know, Job lashed out at God in the midst of all of his losses, and he demanded his day in court with God. And he kept on yelling at God about his situation, and finally God put Job in his place. I think God encourages us to get it out. There are psalms of lament where the psalmist will cry out to God, "How long, O Lord?" And it sounds angry. It sounds like the man is terribly upset at God for whatever he was dealing with. And I think God expects it. You and I need to remember to be respectful as we feel these emotions of anger and sorrow and grief, and as we feel those regrets, as we feel the difficulty to pray. You've been through the path of grief. You know there are days that you don't feel like talking to God. And those of you in our congregation know that maybe 2 or so years before Linda was diagnosed with her issue, I had become very infatuated with the importance of prayer. I was in my office one morning working on a sermon or a class, and the thought struck me that the disciples asked Jesus to teach them to pray. And I remember thinking, that's odd. Of all the things they could have said to him, why would they want him to teach them to pray? If I'd been among the disciples, I would have wanted him to teach me to be a better preacher, better teacher. Maybe I'd want the gift of healing so that I could do some of those miraculous signs and heal people of infirmities and lift burdens from people. But that's not what they said. Teach us to pray. So I prayed that prayer. Lord, teach me to pray like your disciples asked you. Within days, I was deluged with prayer resources. And during the time, since then, I've encountered some very powerful people of prayer. I've learned a lot about prayer. Did you know there's a prayer movement going on in America right now? That there are people in this movement who are devoting themselves and their congregations to prayer in very powerful ways. I think biblically the number one thing that we have missed in churches of Christ is the importance of corporate prayer in our assemblies. Jesus said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for the nations," not a house of preaching, not a house of worship, not a house of ministry, not a house of this, not a house of that, a house of prayer for the nations. And if Jesus calls us out on that, don't you think it's important that we engage in it. Acts chapter 4 gives us an example of a prayer meeting of the early church. We don't have a full example of worship services or a lot of things that happened in the first century among churches, but we've got that example in Acts 4 of prayer. And as I entered into the issues with Linda, there were times that prayer just didn't seem to ring very true. And I found it difficult to pray. And maybe you've been there. But what I know is God is faithful to us. And in those days when I had difficulty lifting my words of prayer to our Father, the Holy Spirit made intercession for me with words I could not utter. Prayer is important. Sometimes it's tough. Sometimes we don't feel like it. And sometimes we just have to hang in those difficult times. I've learned that adjustments are hard. It's hard to make this transition. There is now the aloneness and the quietness in my house. For those of you that knew Linda, you knew that Linda liked to talk. Now it's quiet. That's an adjustment. It's not as easy as some of you have made it appear to be in the grief process through which you have gone. It's a difficult thing in some ways. It's a hard work to make the adjustments. But what do we do when we need to make this or any other kind of adjustments? In Habakkuk chapter 3, Habakkuk starts talking about what happens when the fig trees don't produce and the olive tree or the figs don't produce and the grapes don't produce and various other things don't happen. And he cries out and he says, "But God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like deer's. He makes me tread on my high places." So how do we make the adjustments? How do we deal with the hard issues? How do we deal with the hard emotions that we might not expect us to have? Habakkuk says it. We trust God. We go to God. Notice that in the midst of all those problems that he talks about in verses prior to verse 19, notice that here he doesn't say, "And God will take away all your problems." That God's going to make your path smooth. That it's going to be easy now that you've called on God. It's not what he says. He said God's going to give you the feet of deer so that you can walk on the high places, your high places. Have you seen the sheep and rams and goats and so on that live in the high country? And how they seem to effortlessly jump across those cliffs and so on. And you ever wonder how in the world they do that? Well, they have special feet that enable them to leap tall buildings in a single bound. And God's going to give those to you too. And you'll tread your high places, your high places. And it may not be the same as what I'm going through, and mine will be different than what you're going through, but there are feet to be had that we deal with as we go. Now, let me mention a fourth lesson I've learned. And this is not in your notes if you're looking at the internet. This should have been. In fact, it should have been real high up in this list. But I thought about this, and for the sake of time, I'm going to mention it a little bit too briefly. One of the things I found is that you all, the church, congregation of God's people at this place, are incredibly important to me. You are not just my job. You are not just my occupation. What I found is that you are my family. Kind of knew that. You know, biblically, you read the scriptures and you talk about the community of believers and you kind of understand that. But I experienced this in a very real way. when Linda passed. Outpourings of encouragement and support, nothing like I'd ever seen. When we had the funeral service, and following the service, normally what we do is provide a meal for the family. But that day, I didn't want you just to give a little bit of food to our little family. I wanted to share the time with you. That day we had a potluck together because you are my family. I'm living in Oklahoma, obviously, and I'm living in Oklahoma alone. My daughter lives in Arkansas. My brothers and mother live in Kentucky. And God's sense of humor, He sends me to Oklahoma, and I don't know if the joke's on you or me. But I'm alone, family-wise. But I'm not, because you are my family. When Linda died, I took a couple of weeks off. Went to a couple of places that I wanted to see that Linda didn't care about. Went to Santa Fe for a little while, came back, flew to Charleston, South Carolina for a little while, and I'm not going to go into all the details as to why I wanted to go to those places. But I didn't want to be gone too long, because I didn't want to be away from you too long. You are my family. You are a source of strength and encouragement to me. You encourage me with words. You encourage me with presence, E-N-C-E. And you encourage me just with your smiling faces. Now, I made a mistake in not taking more time. I came back too soon. I thought I was tougher than I was. And I thought I didn't want to be away, that it would be good to get back in the routine. It'd be good to do this therapy, preaching, get back into that routine and I'll get through it. And what I was finding was that I was distracting myself from my grief, and I really wasn't dealing with it. In about August, I hit a wall. And our elders came to me and they said, "We want you to go on a sabbatical. We want you to take 4 weeks off. Go anywhere you want to go, do anything you want to do, just don't come here for a month." And I reluctantly took that sabbatical. It was a major gift to me. Now, I know our elders are guys, people like the rest of us. They have their flaws. But I want to tell you, these elders have been more gracious and supportive of me than in any other congregation I've ever worked with, I've ever seen elders be that encouraging or that supportive of anybody. So I went. For 4 weeks, I had my Bible, my notepads, and I was off and running. Went to some more places that I wanted to see. Went back to where I grew up in Florida, spent some time there. And during those 4 weeks, I had the closest relationship with God that I've ever had. And I felt challenged in a lot of ways. But there was a side of me that wanted to get back and be with you. That I was excited to get home and to be part of us again. And I'm just grateful for that time away, but also to come back. Now, if you're following along in the outline, we have finished half. I've already whittled this thing down and whittled this thing down. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to the sermon outline on our internet, on our website, and I'm going to let you do some homework. I want you to notice, and I'm going to buzz through these very quickly, when Abraham lost Sarah, When she died at age 127, the rabbis believe that the reason Sarah died was because Abraham took Isaac up on the mountain, and he was going to offer him to God as a sacrifice. And of course, God stopped him. We have the ram and so on, the sacrifice that Abraham and Isaac made. When they got back home, according to the rabbis, Sarah said, "Where you been?" And Abraham said, "Took the boy up on Mount Moriah and was going to kill him." And the shock was so bad for her that she died. And I don't know if that's true. That's one of those things that, they kind of read into the story. But at age 127, Sarah dies. And Abraham begins the mourning process as he goes through and he weeps for Sarah, which I think is incredibly important. This spiritual giant of a man, Abraham, has just offered his son on the mountain, comes home, and Sarah dies. He takes her to Hebron, and he's going to bury her in the cave of Machpelah, and he weeps. Jesus wept. Abraham weeps. It's okay if you and I weep in our times of loss. But he mourns her and weeps for her. And then he gets up, and begins speaking to the Hittites, and he becomes proactive in the burial of Sarah and buying the cave at Machpelah. And then he becomes productive in the fact that he increases his holdings in the land of Canaan. He goes on to marry Keturah, and they have sons, and he has sons with the concubines, and literally he becomes the father of many nations as a result of this process. Go read that, Genesis 23. Read and think about this process with Abraham. I want you to notice, too, in addition, the importance of prayer in all of this. I know there are times it's hard to pray. You may not be in a grief of the loss of a loved one to death. It may be a divorce. It may be a loss of a friendship. It may be a loss of a job. There are all kinds of losses that really hammer us in a lot of ways. At the beginning of this sermon, I skipped over some statistics. But if you go back and read the first part of the sermon, University of Virginia Medical College did a survey a couple of decades ago, found out many factors attributing to depression among people. And if you have a serious illness, your depression chances go up 300 and something percent. And if you have divorce, it's a high percentage. If you have marital issues, a high percentage. And if you have the loss of a loved one, it's 1,500 or something percent higher chance of depression than just normal life. So all of these issues deal with us. So any of these can kind of suck the life out of our prayer life. But David said this, "I love the Lord because he's heard my voice and my pleas for mercy. Because he inclined his ear to me, therefore I will call on him as long as I live." It's real important that we read the Scriptures, because there are times you just don't feel like it. There are times that you feel like your prayers go this high and no further. But the Bible says God hears. And David says, I'm going to keep calling on God because God hears me. And that helps us, that motivates us to higher things. Back in the late 1800s, this is really good stuff. I hate for you to miss it, but read it online. Back in the late 1800s, Horatio Spafford was a lawyer in Chicago. And you probably know the story of Spafford and his family. But in 1871, Spafford had lost his infant son, and the Great Chicago Fire had also occurred. So he lost a child. He lost his holdings along Lake Michigan because of the fire. And he and his family were pretty devastated. So in 1873, he decided that he and his family would go to France for a vacation. And a friend of his helped him make arrangements to get on a luxury liner and go to France. But Spafford had some business things he needed to tie up before he went. So he sends his wife and 4 daughters ahead of him, and about a week later, he was going to meet them in France. So on November the 19th, he sends them on the ship. 2 days later, in the North Atlantic waters, another ship collides with their liner. The ship went down in about 12 minutes. Mrs. Spafford was knocked unconscious. The 4 daughters were swept away from her. Somehow, miraculously, Mrs. Spafford was rescued, but the 4 daughters drowned. Spafford heard of the accident. He waited anxiously for 10 days to hear about what happened to his family. Finally, from the hospital in France, Mrs. Spafford sent a telegram. 2 words: saved alone. Immediately, Spafford, of course, knew that his daughters had died in the wreck, that only his wife was left. He shook uncontrollably, they said, and his good friend helped calm him down and then helped him make arrangements so that he could go on to France and meet his wife and bring her home. He got on the ship, and they set sail. He asked the captain, "When we get near the place of the accident, please come and get me." So late one night, the captain did exactly that, walked to Mr. Spafford's cabin, knocked on the door, woke him up. Spafford went out to the railing of the ship and looked down in those dark black waters that covered his little girls. And he wept uncontrollably. He composed himself, went back to his cabin, and sat down and wrote the words to this song. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. How's your soul? Is it well? We're going to be standing in just a moment and singing this song. If you have a need this morning with which we can help you, we want to encourage you to respond. God is the place. God is the healer. And if you need to come, we want to invite you to come now. So let's stand, let's sing together.